Hi, my name is Sven Clement and I'm an MP for the Pirate Party in Luxembourg. And what I wanted to talk to you about is my bill about direct air carbon capture or carbon sequestration in general, because what is clear is that if we want to achieve a path of 1.5, IPCC is clear. We need to act not now, but yesterday. And if we didn't act yesterday, we need to use every technological tool at our disposal. And one of those tools that is well understood, but not yet scalable, is direct air carbon capture. The advantages are multiple. We can sequester carbon that has been emitted in the past. So we can be reducing carbon in the air right now. Initially, it will be not very much. It will be a drop in the bucket. But when you have such a big bucket as we currently have with carbon emissions, every drop counts. So the goal would be to entice people to build, invest, and run direct air carbon capture in a distributed manner in Luxembourg, but also internationally. The goal would be to help sustain, but also to grow an environment and ecosystem where those drops can multiply so that the bucket can empty much quicker. My main goal and thought process behind the bill was inspired by feed-in tariffs for solar energy. We all know, and academia has presented a very well thought of process to reduce prices on solar and how that happened. And that was essentially the feed-in tariff structure, originally thought of in Germany and then on a success streak across the globe. A feed-in tariff for carbon would be very strange. We don't want to entice people to put more carbon into the atmosphere. So essentially, we are doing the opposite. We would be subsidizing taking carbon out of the atmosphere with two different tiers. One, you take carbon out. Every ton of carbon you take out gets a subsidy. And if you sequester it in a durable material, in that case, you get a second subsidy. If you decide to reuse, so recycle carbon that has already been emitted, as an example for sustainable aviation fuel, or in this case, the S would not stand for sustainable, but also for synthetic. In that case, you only get a part of the subsidy because you have a commercial interest in reusing the carbon. So essentially, the bill has two objectives: to reduce carbon emissions right now, reduce carbon in the air right now, but also create an ecosystem that will allow us to reduce carbon much quicker in the future. The goal of being net negative by 2050 can't be achieved by simply reducing our consumption. Degrowth, as it's often called, is not the only solution. Part of the solution is reducing our use, reducing our consumption. But essentially, we also need to take carbon back out of the atmosphere if we want to achieve the goal of 1.5 or in the worst case, 2.0 degrees increase. The IPCC is pretty clear on that issue. We can't simply rely on changing our behavior. We now need to also engineer our way out of this crisis. To do that, this bill will build a foundation that then can be built up by private companies, by governments, and hopefully it will be a big impact on our goal to achieve net carbon neutrality before 2050. The bill will be brought forward into Parliament this week during the COP, and hopefully we can get some traction on it in Parliament, in committee, either before the elections next year, that will happen in October 2023 in Luxembourg, or at the latest after the elections, so that we can move on a bill that would create a foundation for reducing our carbon emissions that are already in the air without relying on some invented numbers of how many trees we could possibly plant, because Luxembourg is already very foresty. We have a lot of trees, And I couldn't imagine where we would plant all those trees that would be needed to offset the carbon emissions in Luxembourg. So we also need to think about mechanical trees and direct air carbon capture, especially in a distributed manner. I'm very positive that will have an impact and hopefully growing impact on reducing our emissions.
Thank you so much, Deputy Clement, for joining us and for breaking this news this week during COP27 that you'll be introducing the Luxembourg Negative Emissions Tariff, which is the first policy of its kind in the world, which is very, very exciting and timely for this week. Just wanted to ask you a few questions if you could provide some additional context and background on your rationale. I think one question that might be on people's minds when they hear this announcement is just about Luxembourg. Luxembourg is a kind of a unique, it's a small nation, but it's also one that has a kind of a global footprint. So I'm wondering if you could try to link a little bit the actual policy substance to the Luxembourg context. Why Luxembourg?
So first of all, Luxembourg is currently the silver medal holder when it comes to the Earth Overshoot Day. We are just one day behind Qatar. So we are neck and neck with Qatar when it comes to polluting the planet. This has partially to do with our geography. We are sitting snugly between France, Belgium, and Germany. And for most days of the year, we have the cheapest gas prices. So people come to Luxembourg to fill up their tanks, and their emissions are being counted towards the Luxembourg emissions. But that's obviously an excuse. It's an excuse to not act decisively. And my goal was to act decisively. And when you say Luxembourg punches above their weight, you're right. When it comes to the financial sector, we are one of the biggest financial sectors in the world. On a per capita basis, we are certainly one of the biggest. We have the biggest fund industry in Luxembourg. We have a huge green bond market. So we are used to innovating when it comes to financial products. We are used to innovating when it comes to greening the financial place. But what we are not used to yet is greening our economy. So my goal is twofold. I want to boost our local economy by creating a new program that will entice people to invest, to build, to tinker, and to hopefully deploy their solutions to reduce emissions on a national, but we all know emissions are not national, they don't know borders, they are global. So hopefully that will have an impact. And the second goal is to deploy that financial know-how Luxembourg has to create something that will reduce global emissions sustainably. We all know that initially paying subsidies is a way to boost development, but it can't be an end in itself. The goal is to create private enterprise surrounding negative emissions. Part of that is recycling carbon. Part of that is using carbon that we need for different use cases to supplant current fossil fuels. Whether it is in aviation, in shipping, we currently commit to emit every time we buy a new plane, a new ship, even if the ICE, the internal combustion engine, would be finally forbidden in 2035 in the EU, there would still be cars running with ICEs. The last car that would be sold on the 31st of December 2034 would still commit to emit for their lifetime. Because let's not fool ourselves, nobody will change the engine of a car to reduce carbon emissions. Planes will not be changed into electric planes, which will be very difficult to do anyway, and also not converted from a fossil fuel to hydrogen fuels, because they are different engines. In shipping, it might be more doable, but even there, I don't believe that it will happen in a very quick succession. So every new item with an ICE that we buy until they are not being sold anymore, commits to emit for the future. So we need to find ways to reduce those emissions as well. And to do that, we have tools at our disposal. We know how to synthesize methanol. We know how to use methanol as a combustor in fossil fuels. We know thus how to reduce our carbon emissions by essentially re-emitting the same carbon over and over again. So part of carbon captures, part of the interest I have in carbon capture is that we can reuse and recycle carbon that has already been emitted in the past. And secondly, and there the government needs to intervene, is storing carbon that has been taken out of the air. Because currently I don't see any market for sequestering carbon in the long term. The carbon taxes that are existing at the moment are certainly not high enough to make it a workable and financially viable business model. So the government needs to intervene if we want to sequester carbon for the long term.
Great. Over the last year and changes, we've been able to work together on this policy. I've learned more about Luxembourg as well as about it's obviously a global financial center, but the population is very global as well. It's a melting pot as well. So I think that symbolically, at least, by putting a policy like this in place in Luxembourg, it'll be interesting to see how it amplifies more broadly. The other thing I think that is very notable about the policy, it's unique in its design. It obviously draws from the feed-in tariff in certain key ways, but there's something that you put in the DNA of this bill from the very, very earliest stages, and that was an emphasis on democratization and a favoring of distributed forms of the technology. And there's really good economic arguments that could be made for that. Those are the types of technologies that tend to get cheaper, faster, and innovate quicker. But it seemed like there was more of a sort of a philosophical or principled basis for this as well, that you really wanted to make sure that this wasn't something that was just captured by large incumbent corporations, but that potentially all kinds of different people, whether adopting or investing or working in, could potentially gain benefit from. Can you tell me a little bit more about that motivation or that principle and why it's so important to you?
Yeah, you're right that it's part philosophical, but also part rooted in economical theory. B2C tends to move faster than B2B when it comes to adopting new technologies. It will be much easier to deploy smaller units in a higher number than to deploy bigger units. When it's finding the power to power them, whether it's finding this place or having the permits to build them. We all know that big infrastructure projects take years and years and run over budget every time people try to do it. Whether it's airports in Germany or currently when we talk about renewables, wind farms, wherever you want to build them, they run over. And if somebody makes an argument that nuclear energy is the savior for our problems with carbon, just look at how big those projects are and how costly they are and how long they take to build. There's not one project that is on time, in budget. So I wanted to go the other way. I wanted to start small and then scale it up in a traditional B2C model, so business to customer, or in this case, government to customer model. We want to allow people also to be beneficiaries of their actions. If only big companies can participate, or if we build a policy that is interesting for big business, then we essentially finance their shareholders. We finance shareholder profits with public money. That's a redistribution from the bottom to the top. And philosophically, that's not something I can stand for. I'm all for free markets, social market economy, obviously, like most Europeans, but I'm opposed to having a money grab for shareholders at the cost of taxpayers. So it's partially also a very conscious policy decision to enable smaller investors, the traditional saver, to be able to put a dent into the universe by removing their own carbon emissions. If we want to achieve net neutrality by 2050, everybody needs to reduce their emissions. There will be some that can actually reduce their emissions by reducing their consumption. And if we want to achieve net neutrality, we need to bring everybody onto the same boat. And if we row all together in the same direction, we can actually make sure that the boat won't capsize. The problem is, if we create a system that entices a few select to row in a different direction than the majority, then we will have social unrest, we will have unhappy masses, and that's something politicians normally don't like, except if you are from the very special sort of policymakers that thrive on social unrest. But personally, I would prefer to have policies for the common good. If not, I would not have dared to adventure into creating policy that enables us to hopefully help us all together to save the planet. It will not be the only solution. I hope so that it won't be the only solution. I hope that we will have a lot of paths that will lead to the same goal, and that we can all walk those paths together. And this policy is part of a solution, but it's not a solution in its own way. It's simply a path toward that people can walk on. And if we want people to walk on a path, we need to make it possible for them to walk on that path.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that we learned in our collective study here of how to design the policy was looking at the feed-in tariff and the history of that. And a key to its political survivability over multiple decades was that it did allow a little something for everybody. Everybody could sort of participate in it. And that's what I think gave it its sort of durability politically over time. So it's a wise cue to take from, I think. And then the last thing I just wanted to get your thoughts on is the way that this bill came to be. The OpenAir Collective, we're a global network of activists focused on negative emissions, introducing legislation all over the United States and now in Europe. And it's usually our activists approaching politicians and informing them. You did it a bit differently. You came into OpenAir Collective just like every other member, expressed your interest in this, and then together we co-developed the bill with input from a lot of different experts in a very transparent way. So I didn't know if you wanted to just quickly summarize what we did and why it is that you were on board for that, I guess, because it's quite unique, at least in our experience.
So maybe I have to first give a bit more background on my political CV. I'm a pirate. The pirate movement has been created to democratize politics, to make it more transparent, to make it more participatory. And if we know that policy needs to be made, we try to make it evidence-based. So if you want to draw up a legislative proposal, the best way to do it is to talk to experts. The problem is, if you are not yourself an expert, how do you know to which experts do you need to speak? So the first goal when I joined the OpenAir Collective was to be exposed to the right people, to be able to talk to the right people, to get a better sense on where the policy could take me. It was a very open process, an open-ended process, and a process where I was not sure initially how it would end. Finally, we met a lot of people, we discussed with a lot of people, and everybody had that little tiny bit of insight that furthered the writing of the bill. Each and every person we talked to was one piece of the puzzle. A few pieces were bigger, a few pieces were smaller, but each and every one we talked to enabled me to see a much broader, but also a much more precise image of where we were heading, what could be achieved. And then on top of that, we decided to open up the process in enabling people to comment on the bill, to co-write legislation. It's also something very unique, where we enable people to see the bill while it was being developed. And I think we enable people to see it, to feed back into all those moving pieces. So maybe our negative emissions tariff is also a feed-in tariff for ideas. We managed to get a lot of input on how to better write the policy. And I give you one example. Initially, nobody, because it probably was too obvious for everybody, thought about enhanced recovery for oil companies. The problem is, the bill, how it was written initially, would have probably allowed oil companies to use the carbon that had been captured to enhance their oil production, which would have been immensely silly. And given our open process, given our process where we enable people to contribute, we caught that problem before finalizing the bill. And I think that's also a testament to the resiliency of open legislative work. It was transparent, it was participatory, and it allowed us to use collective intelligence to create better legislation that is evidence-based, and that would probably not have seen the light the same way it did if I would have tried to do that alone in my office with my staff members. So I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I'm very grateful that you were up to the task and willing to go along with that challenge posed to you by a silly young opposition MP from a tiny, tiny country in the middle of Europe. And in the end, I'm very happy that we achieved a bill that can be presented to Parliament during the COP, which is a first in many, many ways. It's a first negative emissions tariff. It's a first bill, at least for me, that has been not only co-written by volunteers and myself, but also being discussed in a very open and transparent way. We have all the streamings on YouTube. We have a lot of exchanges that happened with a lot of experts. And I think that it's time consuming. It certainly can't be done for every bill. But I think for major pieces of legislation, having that open and honest dialogue and exchange of ideas leads to better bill writing. And a lot of legislators would be very clever if they would copy at least part of those ideas.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that it really made for a good bill. It was essentially crowdsourced, but in a kind of a way that we definitely selected for people that had diverse perspectives and a lot of different forms of expertise. And just as the topper for that, we shortly after you deposit the bill, we're putting it up, the final version on GitHub. So it will be actually put up as a open source document that others can look at. They can fork it into their own country if they want to use the language of software. And I think that is also an innovative aspect of this, not just the substance of the policy, but the way you're going about making it and sharing it with the world. So with that, I want to thank you again, Deputy Clement, for your persistence, your thoughtfulness, and your leadership in putting forward what's an excellent policy, which hopefully will be an inspiration to other nations as well. So thank you so much, and best of luck with the upcoming Parliament.
Thank you very much, and thank you for all the support you and the whole network gave me. Thank you.